All right, welcome to the Rural Ed Leaders podcast, where we explore the unique opportunities, challenges, and research shaping successful rural education leadership. We're your hosts, Dr. Michelle Rinehart and
Dr. Bradley Carpenter.
And we are so glad that you're here to learn from uplifting stories, practical strategies, and insightful discussions that will equip and empower you as a rural ed leader.
So today we are beyond excited. You see on our screen here, we're excited to welcome Dr. Ty McNamee from the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. We like your background there, Ty. He's an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Mississippi. Growing up as a gay, poor, and working class student in rural Wyoming has really shaped your research agenda. Ty conducts research on higher education access, success, equity for rural students, particularly those from poor working class backgrounds, as well as college teaching and learning, faculty development at rural post-secondary institutions. You got to hang with us. We got to brag on you a little bit, Ty.
Yes, absolutely.
Ty serves and participates in the ASH Association, which a lot of our listeners will be familiar with. It's the Association for Study of Higher Education, ARA, all the acronyms. He holds a doctorate of education in higher and post-secondary education from Teachers College Columbia, a master's in education from Student Affairs from the University of Connecticut, and a bachelor's in English from the University of Wyoming. Dr. McNamee, we're so thankful to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you all inviting me on here, and I'm excited to chat.
Say that again.
Cursor, your cursor.
My cursor's on Ty's beard. I'm going to move my cursor off your beard. And Bobby edits all this, so that will not be in our YouTube clip.
Do you need him to say that last part again, Bobby, about Dr. McNamee? We're so thankful you joined us today so Ty can respond.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, hey, look at this. See, we get
I got you.
Dr. McNamee, we're so thankful to have you today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate y'all inviting me, and I'm excited to chat.
Awesome. Looking forward to the conversation. Bradley, start us off with our first question for Ty today.
So, Ty, your personal journey is compelling. I mean, everybody's got a compelling personal journey, but you grew up on a working class Wyoming farm.
Love that.
Significantly influenced your research. Talk to us a little bit about how your upbringing in a rural community helped shape your academic interests and your research priorities.
Absolutely. I feel like if other folks have listened to me tell my story before, they're going to be bored, but I'm going to tell it all over again because it really did shape where I'm at now. I grew up, like you said, a gay student, a poor and working class student, on a farm and ranch in rural Wyoming. In Wyoming, we say farm and ranch because we had crops and cattle, so you'll say farm and ranch all the time.
So good.
In the South, where I'm at now, it's just cattle farm, but we say ranch in Wyoming.
Got it.
Yeah, I was from a town of about 600 people. Now it's less than 500 people. Shoshone, Wyoming. And I really loved it there. Had great, teachers and counselors. My family support system was great. But it wasn't until I got to the University of Wyoming where I did my undergrad, where I faced some really steep difficulties my first year. A lot of cultural stuff, a lot of social stuff, a lot of financial things, sort of like figuring out the norms of this place that was so different from where I grew up. And so even though they serve a lot of rural students, it's still this like flagship big public university that was just so different than, how I'd grown up. And I actually ended up almost going on academic probation, doing pretty poorly in my first semester and transferring out of the University of Wyoming. But I always credit like my friends, my family, the staff and faculty that were on campus for helping me get through that and sort of turning things around and being able to stay at the University of Wyoming. And so it was because of that that I decided to go into higher education and student affairs for my master's at the University of Connecticut. So I went to, again, the flagship, the land grant in the state, but it was much larger, way different region in New England than I was used to.
Right.
And I, again, faced some like really big obstacles, especially cultural and social. And I almost dropped out of that program in the first semester. But again, I had some amazing folks in the program that, really talked me into staying and supported me through that. So, all that to say, I get to the second year of my master's program. And I have a professor, and I always name her. I know her name's everywhere because I say it all the time.
Let's promote her.
It's like the trajectory of my life.
Right.
Milagros Castillo Montoya. I stayed after class to ask her about stuff post-graduation, and she was the first one to ask me, why aren't you pursuing a doctorate after graduation? And did you know that you can study higher education? And she asked me what my research interests are, and these are questions that I'd never really, been asked. I knew I'd probably get my doctorate someday, but I never even knew about this whole world of academia.
Right.
And so I thought about it for a week or two and came back to her, and somewhere in the universe it said all the things that I sort of went through at the University of Wyoming and at UConn. It was really sort of this idea of like, because I was from a, agriculture, small town background, this sort of like working class background that I now have the vernacular to talk about.
Right.
But at the time I said, it just feels like no one's talking about like rural poor students like me. And Dr. Castillo Montoya, I credit her because she was like, you could make this like your big part of your research agenda. And so I applied to doctoral programs with her help and help from other faculty mentors. And I ended up at Teachers College at Columbia University. And it was there that I had amazing higher ed faculty that taught me lots about theory and research, helped me continue to understand what the world of academia is. And even though we were in, one of the biggest cities in the country, they really supported me doing this rural work, and they were really interested in doing this rural work, both administrators, but also my faculty. And so, financially, they helped us do programming around rural education issues. I was able to do, some projects in class around rurality and higher ed. And all of a sudden, this became my research agenda.
That's really
and
cool.
So, now I get to do some me search, as you say, and I do a lot of stuff around rural students in higher education, particularly rural poor and working class students and rural queer students, which is sort of a burgeoning area that I've been focusing on. And then I have these other two areas that I care about: rural faculty development and rural college teaching and learning. But really, it truly stems from being this like rural working class kid growing up in Wyoming. And now I get to do, this research around students who are similar to me, maybe different than me, but we're all these sort of like small town kids. And we're in college, and how do we make sure that we get those kids and students to and through college? So that's really what I care about, a lot of my research, and it really all stemmed from just growing up in Shoshone, Wyoming, and these places.
Love that. And one of the things I'm hearing from you, Ty, is that, in that, first year of challenge, or really in those multiple years when you experience challenges within higher education, you could have taken a stance of like, well, I guess university just isn't for me, right? And moved back home and done something different. But instead, you had people kind of speak truth into your life and speak supports into your life around to really answer the question of like, what do I need in order to be successful here? And then that sounds like that's grown into this larger research where you've tried to really codify that and think about, rural students who are coming in who at first may not be being successful in higher education. It may not be about aptitude or potential or ability, but there might be other things that they need. And I'm sure that's some of what we're going to get into today to help them be more successful. So so powerful in terms of how taking your life's trajectory and then thinking about, wait a second, I am not the only one that this has happened to, right? Who else has this happened to? And what are the supports we can provide this group of students? Rural students make up 20% of kids across the United States, to think about how to help them be even more successful in university.
Well, it made me think about you too, Michelle, and the superintendents. I know we're going to have a wide spectrum of people that listen to this podcast, a lot of them sitting leaders. What does it make you think of, Ty's answer, in terms of when you're sending kids off to college? What types of things did that response help you think through in terms of what you send students to college with cultural knowledge, social knowledge, et cetera?
Well, one of the things you talked about, Ty, and I still don't have a term for this. You may, or if not, then holler at me when you come up with a term for it. But I'm going to go back to when I was a rural student. I grew up in rural Ontario, Canada, first generation to go to, we called it university there, but to go to college. And in high school, I loved math and physics, right? Loved math and physics. And so I remember talking with my high school guidance counselor about like, what can I do in math and physics? And what's the top student in my class, right, was really successful in those and was guidance counseled into, you would be a great math and physics teacher. And like, spoiler alert, I ended up being a great math and physics teacher, right? And that led me on this path into leadership and into the superintendency. But I remember getting to university, and it was probably my second year at university. First year, I was in these math and physics classes with hundreds of kids. And then in second year, there's only like maybe 20 kids in our math and science classes. I remember thinking like, where'd they all go? Well, then I learned that most of them were in a program called engineering. And up to that point in my life, I had never heard of engineering. And it wasn't something that within my rural farming family, we didn't know any engineers, right? We didn't know that like, hey, if you're really strong in math and physics, this could be a good fit for you. I didn't end up getting counseling at the high school level that said, hey, this is what this is and what this could look like. And so it's not like it's not necessarily social capital, but it's some of that, like we didn't know what we didn't know.
Right.
We knew professions that had been in our family or in our communities, but didn't know about other kind of opportunities that our skill sets might align to, and we might have found those out, later in our university studies. So that's what it kind of brought up for me too, those ideas of like, we don't know what we don't know, but that doesn't mean we can't be successful at these next levels,
Absolutely.
All right, Ty, sorry, go ahead. You want to share something on that as well?
I appreciate that. I was going to say my dissertation, which is now turned into a book that's coming out in June. I'm very excited.
Plug it. We'll link it to the podcast.
Please, that's great. The pre-orders go out May 26th, so you can start ordering at May 26th.
All right.
Literally, what you were talking about is some of the exact things that these rural, poor, and working class students that I talked to were discussing as well. This idea of like, one of the students used consulting as an example. Like they were at a selective university in the Northeast, and students kept saying, I'm going to go into consulting. And this student had no idea what they were talking
what
about.
Is that? You get paid to do that? Yeah.
And, they were doing cancer research at some point during their undergrad. And they're like, we literally never had like a research facility in my like area. Like that was not something you did.
Right.
And so like you said, it's this sort of college going knowledge, maybe cultural capital. I've done some research around the strengths that rural students bring and the culture that they do, come with from rural areas. But also we know that these systems and structures value certain types of know-how, certain types of cultural capital. And these students really have to be able to gain that, or, they might not be able to succeed as much in the system as their counterparts that have come from areas where those things are more commonplace.
Absolutely. Okay, great tie into my next question for you. I want to talk a little bit about your dissertation. And so you probably don't like to brag, so I'll do it for you. But your dissertation won the American Educational Research Association's Division J Dissertation of the Year, which, speaking of culture capital, I'm like, I didn't know that was a thing. So you can tell my dissertation or my capstone was not in the running. But congratulations. That is so exciting. It's such a huge honor. But looking at your dissertation, tell us a little bit about it. You studied, as you said, the cultural experiences of rural, poor, and working class students in higher ed. You've kind of given us this high level overview of it. But I'm going to, in answer to this question, I'm going to pivot a little bit to a lot of people listening to our show are public school pre-K through 12 rural ed leaders. And often there's this disconnect between what we do in PK through 12 and then what happens next, right? We prepare our kids to graduate. We love on them. We build strong community. We are all about our kids in our rural communities. We celebrate them at graduation. We announce where we think they're going to go and what we think they're going to do. And then we don't know. We don't know necessarily what comes next or if they really were set up to thrive there. So, what are the things that I, as a pre-K through 12 education leader and some of our other rural ed leaders need to know from your dissertation about what helps kids be successful, or what challenges do our rural kids run into when they move on to higher ed?
Absolutely. And I appreciate that my research is coming out as a book soon, because the book is much more sort of finite and easier to read than this like 300 some page dissertation. So I promise it will be easier to read. And there is also an entire chapter about policy and practice, how we support these students.
Oh, that's great.
To and through college. But, this idea originally started because I was kind of thinking what I wanted to do for my dissertation. And I credit my advisor at Teachers College, Noah Dresner, because I remember distinctly, we were having lunch at this little cafe in New York City. And he was like, well, why don't you go back to what you were originally thinking about, like rural poor students or like rural low income students, however you want to say it. And I was like, oh, okay, let me think about this. And throughout my rural research that I've done so far, I kept seeing this idea of like social class or income coming into this idea of modern rurality. And so, when we think about rural areas that are so reliant on agriculture and natural resources, outdoor recreation, all these sort of like outdoor nature-based fields, we've seen that, and I'm just preaching to the choir at this point, but in recent decades, the agriculture and manufacturing are really declining as industries in rural America. And it's not the fault of those rural communities. There's a variety of, sort of factors at play about why that's happening. I'd love to just blame the capitalistic system, but
not that simple.
But these areas are struggling. So when we look at poverty rates compared to even urban and suburban locales, we see that poverty rates are the highest in rural areas compared to other locales. And so I was like, oh yeah, it seems like there's some sort of financial or like, class-based things happening here. And it seems like modern rurality is really tied to this idea of social class, that if you're from these rural, poor, and working class communities, because of structural and systemic barriers, you'll really be sort of encountering a variety of obstacles in life, variety of disadvantages, even if we know that there's lots of assets and strengths that these communities come with. So I dove into that through the higher ed sphere, and I noticed that so much of the work in recent years had been access focused. And so it was like what you were just saying, how do we get these students to college? How do we celebrate them at the end? Oh, they're going to college, that's great. But when you look at the National Student Clearinghouse data, we would see that it kind of fluctuates, but it's like 56 to 60% of rural students in recent years go to college. They end up actually persisting in their first year, I think over 80% but then within 6 years, only 40% of them have graduated with a college degree.
Interesting.
And when you add this income piece, only a quarter of low income students end up graduating within 6 years with a degree. And so, the data doesn't intersect in that way, but I was like, obviously, if you're a rural, poor, and working class student, you're going to be facing these sort of like rural barriers and social class barriers. And those are really going to sort of like cumulatively impact you if you're going to college and trying to get through college. And so that's why I decided to focus specifically on students, these rural, poor, and working class students who are already enrolled in college, so that I could talk to them about what their experiences were like. And I went to the literature, and we look so often at they sort of, and this was mentioned before, these cultural things that are going on. And a lot of the access literature was saying that it's basically what we were talking about, that there's just little cultural capital in rural, poor, and working class communities, which then translates to lower college going, especially for bachelor's degrees, et cetera. I was like, yeah, I think that's a part of it, but there does seem to be some other cultural factors at play. Let me dive into the cultural literature a little bit more. And so I got these three frames: cultural flexibility, which is the idea that you can still keep your identities and a sense of who you are, but go back and forth between cultural contexts and environments. And then there's this idea of cultural integration, which in past times was really like, how do students culturally integrate into environments and sort of assimilate into those environments? But recent critical scholars have said, but also it's the institution's responsibility to make sure that they're creating culturally engaging environments that students feel like they're a part of. And so there's some sort of complexities there. But then there's also this idea of cultural capital and wealth. And so the idea of cultural capital that I already talked about within this other piece of but there's cultural wealth that minoritized and marginalized students bring with them to higher education that we can't discount, that we should really be capitalizing on. And so I combine these into this theoretical framework of talking about these multiple cultural aspects at play. But on the top here, I had this sort of lens that's but at the same time, we're talking about rurality and social class and how those two come together to create these cultural experiences for these students. And so I credit one of my committee members, Oren Pismoni-Levy, for providing me with a theoretical framework of cumulative disadvantage. And so cumulative disadvantage is not saying that, these poor disadvantaged students. It's saying, no, because of systems and structures, there are these disadvantages that will accumulate across a person's life. And if they have multiple sort of minoritized and marginalized background factors, identities, experiences, that will continue to accumulate. And so I started saying, well, how does that show up at the center of rurality and social class for these rural, poor, and working class students, particularly through cultural lens? And so I can dive deeper into all the findings and things, but I know I just babbled on about how I sort of thought about that. But it really actually helped me because I started thinking by the end of this, it was very apparent that it wasn't just a lack of cultural capital. There were multitude of cultural things happening for these students at one time. And how do we make sure and support, rural, poor, and working class students through those cultural experiences?
Right. Michelle, one of the things that he talked about that is just so exciting because it's in line with our podcasts and our own personal beliefs and worldviews is this, that it's not poor kiddos from these rural towns. He talks about the assets they bring. Talk to us a little bit in your experience about how you've seen that narrative of poor Alpine or poor, whatever school district, and why it's important for us to continue to push that narrative out that we bring a lot of wealth to the table.
Right. I love that. And I love how, Ty, you see both sides of that, right? Like that there can be this cumulative disadvantage. Often in these communities, in rural communities, it's not actually positioned locally and internally as disadvantage, right? And so I think this research is so important to be able to like name that that's still true. And there's things that we have to teach our kids in terms of like, here's the rules of the game when you go to university, right? And here's how these different pieces work so that you can be successful there. You understand kind of the setup of the system that you're going into and how it's different than potentially the place that you're from. But this idea that, these disadvantages locally, we often don't talk about them as like, how the challenges here in Alpine or the challenges in other rural communities. Often we don't see them as barriers. We instead talk about like how we bootstrap things and how how we have to work across different organizations to make things happen, and how we realize like no one is coming to save us. And so you often don't end up in these rural communities where there's this explicit focus on what we don't have, or why. We just try to come up with ways to make things work with what we do have. But I wonder too if that kind of that like, let's get it done, let's do things ourselves mentality can sometimes work against us when we're then positioning kids to go on to that next level, Ty, where we also have to name the fact that like, get it done, let's go, we can do whatever it takes, we can work with anyone, right? Mentality, yes, it will serve our kids in higher ed. And that may not be enough in and of itself, right? There are these other pieces, these other rules of the game that we need to help our kids be equipped to navigate. Maybe that's part of that cultural flexibility you talk about, Ty, where, I know how to be a contributing citizen and what that means in my small rural town, but then I also know, the roles I need to take on to be successful in this next level university as well. Ty, what does that bring up for you?
My mind is like pinging a million different places. What you've said, I'm like, yes, totally. So going back to some of my recent publications, I'm laughing because all of my publications that were pending have somehow all come out this semester.
And congratulations!
Thank you. I have no idea how it all happened, but
you gotta pace those out for the next promotion.
I promise. I'm like, I did not try to get them all to come out in one semester, but here it is. But I had this original research idea back in my doctoral program, and I worked with Sanja Ardwin, who is at Clemson University. She was one of the first people to take me under her wing to do rural research, and she's done a lot of the rural poor and working class college access research. And we did this project together with some other folks, Nikki Cooper, who works for the STARS Network at MIT now, and then Vanessa Sansone at University of Texas at San Antonio. And we were thinking about, like, there is this sort of narrative of like, oh, these poor rural students, like, what are we going to do with them? They need all of this like cultural capital. And again, like we were saying, yes, it is important to gain cultural capital that systems and structures are deeming worthy that you need. But at the same time, we know that these rural areas come with a variety of things that can support them and that we can capitalize on when they're in rural, in college contexts. And so we interviewed students. And we talked to them about this sort of idea of like assets that they bring because they're rural. And a couple things came out of this that I think are really important. The first one is that, it's not to say every institution of higher ed like hates rural students, but if you look at these students' experiences, they oftentimes are having faculty, staff, fellow students stereotype them about being rural, being country. They're having people talk badly about rural America and small towns. The students are sort of like nervous to talk about where they're from because people won't know where it is. So they feel sort of invalidated in that way. There's a variety of sort of examples that come up in this piece, but it's this idea that because of those experiences, higher education institutions can feel like minoritizing and marginalizing environments for rural students. And we know that when minoritized and marginalized populations are in higher education contexts that feel minoritizing and marginalizing, that it can feel bad, but also you can use your strengths from your minoritized and marginalized background to navigate those sort of discriminatory environments. And it's not to say you should have to do that, but you bring a lot of things that you can guide yourself through these environments with. And so that original study is out in the Journal of Higher Education. But a couple of the things that came out of that, this idea that because rural students are from land and nature-based places, that they're using this in classes. It's really interesting when they talk about, one of the students talked about being a biology class, and they're all around all this nature and doing all these sort of experiments and stuff, and they were so shocked that students had never been around that before, the urban and suburban students. They're like, this is where I grew up in the woods, like this is normal to me. And so they're able to sort of use that knowledge in their science classes, especially biology, earth science classes, those sorts of things. But we even saw it come up, in English classes. Students would talk about, I go out in my rural area, I look at the nature around me, and it's inspiring me to do creative writing and write my poetry. And so it's this sort of like connection to land and nature that was one of the strengths that came out of that. Yeah. We did notice that the rural students, one of the other strengths was that they were oftentimes one of the people in the classroom or in the group or whoever it was bringing the perspective of rurality. And so, you'd have other students or faculty and staff saying these stereotypes or talking bad about rural America. And these students would actually have the strength to say, well, actually, think about it this way. This is where maybe they're coming from. And, this was from undergrad classes all the way to PhD classes.
Interesting.
And so it was very interesting. Yeah. But then the final strength that would be very apparent for everybody is this idea of community. And so, you're from small town, you're used to talking to lots of people, you have these tight-knit social networks, and you want to have those in higher ed, and that's how you get through things. That's how I got through things. And they actually talked about how being from a rural area allowed them to build these smaller communities on campus. And so that was really cool. But when I started doing my dissertation and looking at these rural, poor, and working class students, that frame again of cultural capital and wealth came up. And I was like, I feel like there is something here about these rural, poor, and working class students talking about exactly what you all were just mentioning, that, we have this sort of we can do it attitude because we have to do it.
Right.
Like where I'm from, if you want to go to the mechanic, it's 25, 30 miles away. You have to make sure that if you need to fill up a tire or change a tire, you could do it.
Right.
And so that played out in two interesting ways within my dissertation research. One was what you were saying is like, that can actually be a disservice to the students because they're like, well, I can do it. I don't need resources and service. Like I'm used to doing it. So I'm just going to do it. But actually, when you're in these sort of competitive environments with college curricula that you're not used to, that can be really detrimental because you do need those resources and services. And once you do start using those, you could be more successful. But at the same time, these students were they were just brave and interesting because they're like, well, yeah, I know how to like budget and make a meal for all my roommates because like that's what our family did growing up. It's like you make this food stretch, you make this budget stretch to do that. They're like, oh, I know how to do laundry. Like I've been doing these things forever. There's not a laundromat like close by. So, so like they had these ideas of already how to do it. And they also had like this sort of plug to be able to say, I can do things in higher ed because, we're used to doing that. And so there are these strengths that students can bring. It can be detrimental if you're thinking about not just using your strengths and not engaging in any resources and supports and services that are on campuses. But we also want to make sure that we're acknowledging those strengths that these rural students, rural, poor, and working class students bring and capitalizing on them and not just saying, oh, poor rural students, how are we going to, save them? It's not that at all. It's very much, a much more complex process than that.
That's my hashtag for today, Michelle, is RuralEdPluck.
I love it. Oh, yeah. I just
we have a hashtag every show.
And that's such a great example. One of the things I wanted to talk about next is when you're talking theory, Ty, I think one of the powerful things about that comes out of research is the importance of verbiage, right? Giving words to ideas, to themes, to things that people like see and experience. We're like, oh, yeah, that's what it's called, pluck. Yeah, that's the thing. Or even like this idea of like cumulative disadvantage or cultural flexibility and these things that like we see and experience, but then when there's a word for it, it's like, oh, that is a thing. Yes. That's a thing, right? So now I'm going to push you to help me translate some of the theory into practice. So part of it is, okay, we need verbiage to be able to talk about these ideas. But then if we're thinking about, what can our K through 12, pre-K through 12 rural ed leaders who are leading in rural communities, in schools and districts across the country. What do we do differently? Like, there's a lot that we're doing well that are setting up kids to go to college, right? What are some of the tweaks or the ideas based on the theoretical research, right, or the theory that's come out of your research that, boots on the ground? What are the things that we as rural ed leaders can then implement to help our students be even more successful through college?
I was thinking about like college and career readiness, right? Like we all have these measures and metrics we have to meet. So Ty, if you had a room full of Texas CCR specialists, to Michelle's point, how does your theory, how would you translate that to them in terms of practical strategies moving forward?
This is again hilarious because I'm just going to plug a couple other things.
Please plug.
Let's go.
That's what the show's for. Plug.
Well, I will say I have gotten and I very much consider it a compliment that my research and writing are pretty easy to read. Like I try to make it accessible for folks. I hated reading the theoretical pieces in my doctoral program where I was like, this doesn't even make sense.
You're just adding words to add words, like, yes.
These people do not have pluck.
No. And I think they estimate folks that they're trying to actually advocate for.
Sure.
Right.
So I will say I've gotten that compliment on multiple things, but there's a piece that came out last year, the year before, in the Peabody Journal of Education with Karen Gans, who's a scholar practitioner at CU Boulder. And we actually, it's funny that you say this college and career readiness piece, because we use those almost exact same words, because the National Rural Ed Association had their research agenda, and they had this special issue of like, okay, so where do we move forward with this research agenda? What are we missing? Like, how do we sort of, find these next steps? And Karen and I were like, we have focused so much on access and this idea of like, getting students to college that we actually have forgotten about what happens for them when they're in college. And so we have this, integrative literature review where we sort of look at all the issues that we see for rural students across higher education, especially those who are already enrolled in higher ed. And then we provide policy and practice recommendations based on that literature, but also some recommendations for what we could do for future research. So I will say that is out there, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to chat about it. You can absolutely read it. But the other piece that I wanted to make sure and highlight is exactly what you were talking about with this sort of theory to practice. And Janae Willis, who's a faculty member here with me at University of Mississippi, and then Roger Davis, who's one of my PhD students here at the University of Mississippi, and we wrote this chapter that was talking about there is this spatial inequity for rural students, but we also know that rural students come with a variety of other identities and background factors and things that we need to think about, everything from race and ethnicity to queerness to gender to disability status, whatever it is. And so we offer 4 theoretical frameworks of how researchers can engage with rural areas and do rural ed research, but at the same time, bring in these other perspectives to make sure that we're not sort of making rural America into a monolith, that we're thinking about the complexity of experiences that rural students and rural populations will face. So I only wanted to bring those 2 up because it very much like ties into if folks want to do more reading about this, please do it. But here's some things that I would say based upon the theory. So cumulative and again, that book's coming out, and I promise you can buy chapter by chapter, and this us all in this chapter. So if I speak too fast, please go read that.
This is the chapter.
Yeah, this is it. So the cumulative disadvantage, there was 2 areas of that I really wanted to highlight. The first is you have to consider rurality and social class as these sort of like cumulative identities or background factors that students are having, because if you don't, you're going to end up missing the mark on one or the other, especially rural. So colleges and universities love to say we support poor and working class students, low income students, first generation students, whatever they're saying, but they won't think about the rural aspect with that. And the students have this perfect example that I've mentioned before, because I think it is just ideally representative of this. One of the institutions that students were at paid for students to go home for the breaks. They had like a amount of money that every student got. And these students are like, hey, this urban student is having to travel on the train to New York, and it costs them $40.
Right.
I have to fly to the nearest airport, if there even is a nearest airport, Then I have to drive all the way to my like rural hometown, and that's costing me hundreds upon hundreds of dollars.
Right.
I myself used to joke that it was cheaper for me to go from New York City to London than it was for me to go from New York City to my hometown in Wyoming.
It would probably take just as much time, right? Like
If not more, truly. It is a wild, like New York City to Denver, if you can get a straight flight. Denver, if you can get a flight to this local airport, and then it's like a 40-minute drive to our rent. So there's all these things where it's like, well, we're supporting poor and working class students, but if you don't have this rural idea in there, you're going to miss the cumulative nature of these identities and what can happen for these students. And so that's one part that I think is really important when you're a pre-K through 12 administrator, you're a higher ed administrator. You have to think about, yes, these students are rural, that yes, they're poor and working class, but how do those things sort of working together to impact students in specific ways? And then related to that, it was really important for me with using cumulative disadvantage theory, and I've sort of started to talk about this already. When I first started doing rural research, it was easy for me to sort of talk about rural students as a monolith myself. I have a lot of privileged identities. I'm cisgender white male. I come from a predominantly white Christian state. I grew up Catholic. It was very easy for me to sort of think of this stereotypical like rural experience. But I appreciated scholars, both in the rural ed field and in broader ways, pushing me to think, well, there are other rural experiences out there. And so when we think about rural, poor, and working class students, we have to think about the additional identities and experiences, identities and background factors that are going to play into their experiences. And so, for instance, I had a student, she was a South Asian woman student, and she talked about how because she was South Asian, people at her institution would not like stereotype or consider her rural because they wouldn't think of that person being rural from a small town.
Right.
And so that actually was really hard for her because she grew up in a predominantly white area. And now she's trying to like mingle with other students of color and other people who come from South Asian backgrounds. And she's like, we are not like vibing because we don't have these same experiences. And they're also not considering that I'm like a rural person as well.
Interesting.
And so she had this really cool quote. And it's so powerful and of course, I'm not going to get word for word, but it's basically like people will think of me as like a student of color, as poor, as rural, but they don't think about how those things build on top of one another to create really, specific experiences or exacerbated barriers for me. And so that I think is a perfect example of when we're considering cumulative disadvantage, it's not enough to just say, well, it's rural, poor, and working class. There's also these other like factors that we have to, keep in mind so that we're not sort of making into a monolith these rural populations, that they're all having this one experience, that we make room, to tell other stories within those experiences as well.
Michelle,
that's one big
I was going to say, Michelle, it made me kind of wish that, and we're going to have some high school principals on the podcast at some point, but that we had a high school principal with us here today, and maybe you could speak to this as, this idea that once these kiddos get to college, they have these assets. They're now in new spaces where their identities as rural students are not appreciated or stereotyped. Like, how can we better prepare high school counselors or the folks that are helping them apply to college, almost like a to-do list of reach out to these people on your campuses, go to these spaces, like here are people on college campuses that will advocate for you day one. I mean, I don't know, do y'all talk about that in Alpine in terms of, once you get there, think about X.
Right. So powerful. And so a couple things that this makes me think about, notes I made while you were talking, Ty. So like right now in Texas, and I'm sure in many other states across the nation, college and career readiness has been kind of, narrowed down artificially to like a state accountability checklist, right? And I'm sure with the best of intentions, but it's really about like, oh, well, it's something that the schools are graded on, and it means that students have to pass this this college readiness exam or have to score this score on state assessment or have to earn this industry credential. And so, Ty, what you're pushing us to really think about is like, that is such a narrow view of what will help kids actually be successful once they're there, right? That's being used to quote unquote grade schools, but it's not actually like, those aren't necessarily the things that are going to unlock the next level of higher ed success for many of our rural kids, right? So if we only focus on those things and we're like, look at us,
readiness measures, we got an
readiness
A+.
measure, right? We're aiming for 100 or whatever, then we could be frustrated when we see some of our kids moving back home at semester or the first year in, and we're like, we know you're brilliant.
We got an A+ on readiness.
Well, and we know from all the years we spent with you that you can do this, right? And so what's the disconnect there? And so I think, Ty, what you're really pushing us to see is that there's so many other more subtle pieces, that districts aren't measured on, that the state doesn't value or may not even be aware of, if we're being kind of frankly honest about what's really needed.
Just add that to your checklist of how, we need to also do this in high school. Not that you have enough responsibilities, but I mean, to think about that, like, how do we build this into our infrastructure? Right.
And one of the things I really am thinking about from what you shared too, Ty, was building this kind of, I don't say alternative identity, but one of my professors would talk about, like, sometimes you put a coat on, right? I know how to put a coat on and put on a different version of myself in this space as needed, right? But then I can take the coat off afterwards and be who I am. But, teach our students this mind shift around, when you go to this next place, like you're saying, Ty, you cannot do it all yourself.
Sure.
You're going to have to access resources in these empowering ways, and kind of shifting how we think about that. Of like, this isn't falling back on a crutch. This isn't, there's nothing wrong with you that you would need to access these. You need those to be successful, right? And how do we kind of set up that shift? And another kind of piece I wrote down too, I'm kind of going back to my story earlier about kind of finding out about engineering in my second year of university. But the other piece of that is, like, there was absolutely nothing wrong with my family and community.
Right.
That learning didn't happen for me until second year of university. Right. There are other, supports that could have opened those doors to me. But the fact that I came without that knowledge is not, do you know what I mean? Is not like a negative on, right? It's not a deficit for either my family or my community. And so I think there's just so much there for our counselors and our principals, our superintendents, to think about, like, how do we dig into some of this research that you and your teams have put out, Ty, to think about, what are really those strategies we can equip our kids with that'll help move the needle, that goes much deeper than some, state accountability metric.
Absolutely. Actually, I'm like, there's a future publication there. I love how I have not thought about it in that way, where it is this sort of like checklist and narrowing of how we prepare students. And we're really missing this sort of cultural, social aspect of like, this is also what may occur and could be just as important, if not sometimes even more important, when you get into these spaces. In my recommendations, I also talk about, the students talked immensely about college access programs and having, good college counselors or people who can support them and advocate for them. Because if they don't, that's when they said that was really difficult for them if they didn't have these programs or, good counselors, et cetera. And so I think it could be these college access programs, folks in the schools, like folks in the community, having these conversations or doing some sort of workshop or programming to make sure that students are prepared for that. I think it'd be really helpful. I'll use myself as an example. I went in as an honors program student, third in my class, and I was like, I'm going to be great. And I dropped out of the honors program. I had no idea what the Iliad or Odyssey, what were we talking about?
Right.
I had no idea. I was in classes with 300 students, like you mentioned before. I was so overwhelmed, but at the same time, I drew back on my community. I didn't even know that was the strength that I was drawing on to get through that. And so if you could have these conversations, like you're saying, of sometimes you'll need to have on the coat, you're going to have to do these things in higher ed, but also sometimes you might not need the coat, and you can stay connected to your rural background, your rural roots, and that's okay too. That's where that idea of cultural flexibility comes in, that I think is really important.
That's why this podcast, I think, is going to be one of the reasons it's going to be so powerful, is in having guests like Ty on that are in higher ed, because I teach a freshman seminar class here, so I get all first-year freshmen, education majors, and I have kids from urban, suburban, and rural, and none of those kids understand the amount of staff that are here at the university that are paid from their student fees to support them.
Right.
So I tell them all the time, I'm like, there are people at this university that their salary comes from your student fees, and their only job is to help you be successful throughout the year, to help you keep connected. So it makes me think of, why can we not, across that PK-20 spectrum, do a better job? I'm not talking about Ross, but higher ed and high schools getting together to talk about what is that link of, you're a high school senior, here are the folks on the campus that may be able to help you. And then having that college link of, you're new, here's some of the things you were taught in high school. That bridge is so important. Even some wide spaces, or maybe having some forums or some town halls on how to better do that. It's just,
and one thing that brings up for me too is, like, at the high school level, and again in rural spaces, we're often talking smaller high schools where everyone, is known, seen, and valued by name, right? And so on a high school, if you're having some kind of issue, whether it's something going on at home, or you're like, I don't know how to do such and such or whatnot, then like you just walk down to the front office and talk to your counselor. Or like, you're going to see your parents know your principal. And so even if you haven't said anything, they see him in the grocery store and they're like, hey, I just need to put a bug in your ear. Well, there's all these, like you talked about, tight-knit networks that provide these wraparound supports. And so then it's thinking, when I go off to university and I'm student number, blah, 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 and my professor sure does not know my name in row 47 of, of a lecture hall or whatnot. Like, who is the equivalent of my high school counselor? Who is the equivalent of my, AP or principal? Because it's a completely different system where you're like, I know I'm not going to the university president over this, but who short of that, should I be going to have those, kind of quick, I need help conversations where in the high school structure, we knew who those people were, and so did our parents and our community, and there was just a lot easier way to get connected with help.
I mean, I was thinking of, if PK-20 could create some universal language around that position. And I know that, Ty, you may be more familiar with, what are those positions in higher ed that are supposed to be not the president, the provost, but who is the, I got you, I see you, and I got you. What are those positions in college that you know of, and what do they look like?
Yeah, it was interesting in my study, because I would find two sort of dynamics with these folks who were supposed to be supporting students. One, there would be some really amazing people. And so, it could be an academic advisor, it could be a faculty member, it could be a mental health counselor. It could be even like a dean of students type of person. There was these really important mentors and role models, but also just sort of friends that these rural, poor, and working class students needed, and were very good to them. And I really appreciated that folks were there. So, if you can find folks in a variety of offices and services, I think that's the place to go. The only thing that I'll caution folks on is, like, if you become reliant on somebody and they're not doing their job well, I had one of the students talk about how their academic advisor basically said, like, here's your classes, like, move on, I don't have any other information for you. And that student floundered so badly at their large public university that they ended up dropping out. And then they were so hurt that when they dropped out, the advisor, no one at the university reached out to them. And so, you have to make sure that you're finding the right people, because there could be some people who are not good at their jobs or who are not doing well. But I think most of the time in higher ed, folks want to be helpful to students. And so find those people that, are really meaningful to you. I talked, about all these names throughout this podcast of people who I've written with, or, who have been my mentors. And it took me, a little bit to find each of those people. And there were some folks along the way who weren't my people. And so if you can sort of, make those connections, I think that could be really helpful, especially if you're a rural, poor, and working class student trying to navigate this wild world that is higher education.
Love that. All right, I'm going to ask one more question. Then, Bradley, I know we have a closeout question we ask all of our podcast guests as well. And this, to me, is like quintessential rural conversation. And here's what I mean by that. I'm going to switch gears and go a totally different direction for a minute, Ty. But that's also when we see people in town, we're like, hey, I have 3 things I need to talk to you about. They're completely different. Like, after Bradley and I finish, I'm like, hey, we need to talk about those 2 other things that we've got going on, because all of our roles intersect in all these different ways in rural places, right? So, Ty, this might feel like a hard pivot to some, but if you're from rural places, you're like, no, that's not weird at all that we're talking about these 2 different things. Okay, when you were at Teachers College, Which I also love that, you're doing this very rural focused research, or you were, from like one of the biggest cities, right?
In the city.
Yeah, in literally the city. So while you were there, you co-founded the Rural Education and Healthcare Coalition, right? Yeah. And a network focused on rural education, healthcare programming, and research. So that's fascinating to me. And I think it's such an example of how, like, in rural places, we often try to work across things that are siloed in larger places, right? So talk to us a little bit about that. Education and healthcare, where was that coming from? Because like Rural Education Coalition probably would have been a big enough topic. Why both? Talk to us about that.
That's fine. I have an exact answer for that. I will explain as I go along. But in typical rural fashion, I found other folks at Teachers College who were from rural areas. And this was actually after the 2016 presidential election. And it wasn't that we were like trying to found a conservative space or a liberal space or anything like that. But there was all of a sudden these conversations about rural America. And they had not been happening. When I started my degree in 2015, I was the only one talking about rural education in my spaces. By the time I graduated, we had a whole group of us.
Interesting.
And so I met with this professor, Beth Tipton. She's now at Northwestern University, and she's from rural Kentucky. And I was in her stats class, and we were talking about how it's got to be so hard and complex for these rural students to be in this space where everybody's talking about them, but they don't really know how to like be in these spaces that are super hyper urban and liberal, super maybe conservative and rural. And there's all these complexities throughout, obviously. But it's just a lot for these rural students. And so I'd sort of been thinking about how to support rural students. And it was then that we were like, maybe we should found like a student group. And so there was another student, Cassie Ziegler, who was from rural Washington State. And she and I and Beth Tipton, we were like, well, should we found like a rural student group where we can like support one another and talk about what it's like to be from rural areas? And so we did. We founded that group. It was called Rural Student Group at the time, RSG. And we... of course, we didn't want to go in sort of prescribing what we were doing. We wanted to hear from other rural folks and people interested in rural education. And we went into, we hosted open houses. And I think it ended up being like 40 people across those two open houses came. And we had Teachers Colleges, and they'll always say this, the largest graduate school of education, health, and psychology.
You hear that on repeat.
I mean, it's not the number one, but we'll leave that Harvard Teachers College fight for another day. But yes.
Yeah, exactly. So we had students be like, well, what about like healthcare, like rural healthcare? And, sometimes those are separate, but a lot of the times those are really linked. It's like when we're talking about the health and wellness of students, when we talk about mental health care in rural areas, disability support, there's all these things. And so we were like, oh, that's totally fine. Let's bring that into the conversation too. And so Rural Student Group continued. We had a variety of students join. We did symposia about rural education, healthcare every year. We did film screenings. We even did fun social events where we like built gingerbread houses together, and we were like, this is like our little rural home, right? And, we had potlucks where we would bring stuff from our rural areas, like food and things. The only thing that was getting difficult was the name Rural Student Group on CDs was like very confusing to anybody beyond Teachers College. And so we were like, well, what are we trying to do? We're really trying to, advocate for rural education and healthcare, do programming, have a place for support and services. And so that's when we changed it to the Rural Education and Healthcare Coalition, REHC. And we were doing very similar things, but we finally had a name that sort of made sense in the broader space. But we had, like I said, multiple students, and we had some good, tough conversations about what it's like to be rural and be in New York City. We had really supportive faculty and administrators who gave us financial support and showed up to our events to talk about these things. We had amazing keynote speakers. It was just a very positive experience. And as that was happening, I actually started chatting with other folks around the country, and it's become even more of a thing now that there's these rural student groups at other institutions. So Yale has one, Harvard did have one, UGA, Chico State, I think Illinois, CU Boulder, Kent State. They're popping up all over. And it's these sort of groups that can say, we are here to advocate for rural students and talk about rural education issues, rural healthcare issues. Yeah. And I just think it's super important that if we're talking about services and support, that we're like pouring into, but we also want to make sure that we're bringing this rural lens to it. And so I won't say we were the first, but it was very much like, some of the first in that area to say we can have these like support groups or student groups and organizations just around rurality, and that's okay, and people will be interested.
I love that. One last thing I have to add to this before the final question. So, Ty, one thing you said that was really resonating with me as well as a little earlier in the podcast, you talked about differentiating rural poor from poor, and sometimes kind of the words can be used interchangeably,
right?
Or that there's, there's poor people there and poor people here and similar experiences. I want to share about a experience I had recently that, kind of illustrates this. So last month, my son, who's 9 years old, had a medical emergency, and we are blessed to have a hospital here. And I know that that's not true in every rural community, but we're blessed to have one in our community. And he needed to have an emergency surgery, and of course our small town does not have a pediatric surgeon, right? We're not big enough for that. And so he had to be sent 3 hours away from home, and we ended up having to be there in that hospital for 2 weeks. But even the getting there, right? So you're talking about an expensive flight out, and then actually in his case, the weather grounded the flight, and we don't run ambulances from here to the El Paso 3 hours away, right? Yeah. And so my husband and I elected to transport him. But again, when you're thinking about like what that looks like to be, and again, we're blessed at this stage of our life to not be poor. I have absolutely been there before. But when you think of people's experiences as rural poor and what it takes to access certain resources, right? And how that might be different. I'm not saying better or harder or anything like that than poor in an urban area. There are just these different challenges that show up. And so it's important that universities and people in these support positions are kind of aware of the different challenges of what it might look like to be poor in one context versus poor in a rural context, right? So, Bradley, I know you have a question to close us out, too.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things that I like most about Ty's research agenda is he's interrogating these labels and saying it's not just this.
Right.
And, we all know it's human nature to give labels or stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
right.
And so I think interrogating those labels and pulling them apart and saying it's not just this, or, it's important for colleges to hear. I'll speak on our behalf in higher ed, and I was a PK-12 principal as well, so I kind of see both sides. But we have to do a better job of unraveling those monolithic labels when students get here, so that we can specify our services and connect people with the right mentors, et cetera. And so I'm learning so much from this podcast and the people that we're talking to. All right, Ty, you ready for the big finale?
Yes.
All right, no pressure. Right. What advice would you give emerging education researchers or practitioners interested in making meaningful impacts in rural education spaces?
Okay, I'm going to have you repeat it.
What advice would you give emerging education researchers or practitioners who are interested in making a meaningful impact in rural educational spaces?
Okay, I have two pieces of advice. I think two, maybe three will come out of this. The first one is be the voice in the room. We learned that earlier in the podcast, even from students. It's like sometimes they were the only voice in the room talking about these issues. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I was at Teachers College, and it was a very kind thing. It wasn't like making fun of me situation. But at the end of the semester, some other students said that they wanted to talk about like rural education issues. And my professor was like, oh, I could tell Ty was in this class because now people want to talk about rural education. Mm-hmm. And so, like you truly sometimes, especially in research and practice and policy that's focused so heavily on urban inequality, which is good. We want that. We want to make sure that we're bringing rural to the table as well so that we can talk about the issues we were literally just mentioning. So be that voice, I think, is something important. Don't be afraid to be that voice in these spaces. The second thing, and I, again, always credit folks for pushing me to think about this and recognize this. We talk about rural America in these ways where it's, oh my God, that's my dog. I'm sorry. Luke.
You're like, not now.
He's going to be a pod. We'll link him in the podcast.
Famous. Yeah, there you go. We'll just need a picture for that. We'll need a picture. Yeah.
Yeah. So we say rural America a lot. I say it. But when we start to sort of tease apart, there's regional diversity, there's industrial diversity, there's identity-based diversity. There's all these pieces of diversity that can really impact a rural place and the people within those places. And so if you're doing research, obviously we want to talk about rurality and center that in the conversation, but be ready to talk about the specific context that you're studying in, specific populations and their sort of nuanced experiences that they might have. And I think that makes it obviously a little bit more difficult to conduct research, but that's a good thing because you want to sort of complexify what we're talking about in ways that can make room for a broader variety of stories that have not always been told in the rural education literature. So I think that's super important. And then the third thing, please reach out to me. I talk to students and I talk to other collaborators and stuff all the time about rural education research. We have Rural Together, which is a rural community of practice, talking about rural education and practice and policy, especially in the higher ed sphere. We've got all these sort of groups that, AERA, Rural Education SIG, like all these groups that come together to talk about rural education issues. And so be a part of that community and start to get plugged in, and please reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat with folks. And those are my 3 pieces of advice.
I love it.
Sort of thoughts that, as we move forward.
And we got to meet your dog.
Love it.
Yeah, exactly. That's Luke, by the way.
Precious.
Very robust bark.
Ty, we cannot thank you enough for spending time with us this morning, for pouring into us and our listeners to really kind of see this whole other area, right, of research that exists and connects to the great work that's happening every day in pre-K-12 education. And it's really trying to help prepare our students to be even more successful in higher education. So thank you so much for joining us today. As we wrap up today, Rural Ed Leaders, as your listeners, from our small towns to yours, we just want to remind you that your voice matters, your leadership matters, your kids matter. So thanks for being the leaders that your communities need.
Thank you, everybody.